Welcome back to TAD Talks, where every week I sit down with my dad and sustainability expert Tad Radzinski to ask him questions about sustainability topics. Last week we talked about how organizations understand the environmental impacts of their products over their lifetime through life cycle assessments. If you haven't seen that yet, you can watch that video on TAD's YouTube channel. Today we are going to talk more about the embodied carbon in products and why it's important. We are also going to touch on how companies can reduce the embodied carbon in their products. So, starting off with the basics as usual, what is embodied carbon?
Okay, so last week we talked a lot about the life cycle process when you look at basically a product from cradle to grave, or ideally cradle to cradle if we're closing the loop, right? So when we think about the embodied carbon in a product, I gave an example last week where we talked about cutting down a tree in a forest that would then be made into paper or corrugated box. So the embodied carbon would come from the energy that went into the machine that cut the tree down in the forest, then the machine that dragged the tree over to a log truck and then got loaded onto a log truck. All the fuel that would be used for that would be part of the embodied carbon of that actual tree, taking it out of the forest. So the diesel fuel, the gasoline, whatever was utilized in those machines, then the actual transport from the forest to the mill where they're going to basically remove the bark, and then they're going to basically chop the tree up into flakes and then make it into pulp. Every step in that process is going to either use electricity or some type of fuels, maybe natural gas as they're doing it, especially when they go into the pulping process where they're basically throwing those wood chips into a vat and they're cooking them with water and getting the wood chips to break down into the fiber that then becomes the paper. There's a lot of energy that's usually going to be either driven by natural gas or steam, comes from steam, and you have to burn something to get that steam. Then when it goes into the paper making process, a lot of electricity will be used in making the paper, eventually the corrugated box, that kind of thing. So all those fuels that are going to be used in the process of getting that tree out of the forest, transported to the mill, milled into pulp, then that pulp, usually they take pulp and they put it into like bales. They'll send it off to a paper mill then that makes it into like toilet paper, writing paper, corrugated boxes, whatever. All those steps and all that fuel and energy that was used is going to make up the embodied carbon. So we just covered the raw materials, getting them out of the forest, and then the actual manufacturing stage, which would be all of that combustion and whatnot. And I know we talked about this in a couple TAD Talks ago about energy, right? So when we make electricity, if we look at the predominant method of making electricity in our country, it means we burn some type of fuel. It could be natural gas, it could be coal, it could be oil, and every time you do that, you release CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So when we do a life cycle assessment, we're measuring a thing called global warming potential. It's one of the impact categories that we look at, and that basically will measure all the fuel usage, electricity consumption, and the whatever the grid mix is, the way that electricity is produced in a certain area is how you measure the impact of making electricity. So here in Pennsylvania where we are, our grid mix involves nuclear power, it involves renewable energy, it involves burning of natural gas, maybe some coal. So that whole mix of the electrons is made from those different sources, and the portion where you're combusting something actually has a carbon footprint, and that contributes to the embodied carbon of making products. So it's mainly the energy. Now there are some products though that actually contain fossil fuels. So like if I'm making plastic, for example, and I'm taking, say, natural gas and I'm converting that into ethylene to make polyethylene terephthalate, PET number 1, or I'm using oil or whatever, there's basically the embodied carbon of that fuel that was used to convert it into a raw material. So I know this is a lot, but there's multiple things that you have to look at when you think about embodied carbon. And the thing is, every step, all that embodied carbon activity means that we're creating greenhouse gases, which are contributing to climate change. So ideally what we want to think about is what can we do to burn less fuels, use electricity, etc., so that embodied carbon can be reduced. And there's a huge movement on that right now to reduce embodied carbon, especially in building products, even automobiles. There's a lot of organizations really looking at this right now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting and exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And to put things into perspective, the embodied carbon of all of the products that go into a mid-rise office building account for 84% of the building's impact over a 50-year lifetime. Operational carbon only accounts for 16% of that building's impact over a 50-year lifetime. So it's a pretty big deal, and it's, as you said, very important for companies to reduce the embodied carbon in their products. What can these companies do to reduce their embodied carbon?
All right, so number one thing that they can do is they can look at making the process more efficient from an energy perspective. So if you can use less electricity in your manufacturing plant or less natural gas to make the product, that's a huge step forward. Also, another big one is, where do you source your materials from? So let's say our forest example, if you're getting that wood from a forest that's 1,000 miles away, you got to transport that tree really far. So you're using lots of diesel fuel to move that tree. So ideally, why don't you source much closer? Like if you could get trees out of a forest that are only 50 miles away, that fuel consumption is greatly reduced. The same thing goes for any products. Like, when we make products, we might source locally, within the United States or North America for the raw materials. Let's say it's chemicals or other things, or a lot of our products come from China and raw materials, right? So think about that shipping impact of sourcing all the way from China. You got to put it on a ship, like get it on a truck to a ship to here, then onto another truck. You know what I mean? So if you could make choices to select your raw materials closer to your facility, that reduces that transportation energy. And we worked with a company a while ago that we found out that a big part of their carbon footprint and their embodied carbon was the actual transportation of that product from China to the US, because they were actually sending it on planes, aircraft. So the highest carbon you can ever do is shipping something on a plane. So what we did is we did that analysis, and we went through a process where we looked at what we call sustainable product innovation with them. And we said, do you have the ability to maybe produce this raw material or product in another country closer to your market? 94% of what they sold was in North America. So they decided, based on that information, that they were going to actually start sourcing the raw material and doing some of the manufacturing in Mexico. And it cut their carbon footprint by like 60%.
Wow.
By doing that. You know what I mean? So that's one example of how that would work. Another thing you could do is use less materials. If you can dematerialize. If you noticed over the years, our water bottles, the plastic water bottles, if you use them, have gotten a lot thinner. Mm-hmm. Remember in the old days they were really stiff. Now they're really thin, and the caps are even smaller. That's called dematerialization, where we use less materials. That's going to reduce the embodied carbon, because less materials means lower embodied carbon. We can do the same thing with packaging. We actually talked about that a little bit a couple of TAD talks ago about packaging optimization. So these are all different steps that can be done, that you really look at these different things, and you think about the whole life cycle when you're doing this, and using that life cycle information in what we call the sustainable product innovation process allows a manufacturer to really think about these things and make some good decisions. So it's definitely a lot of things, and there's even more that you can do. But I'm just giving an overview of some of the big hitter ones that we'd be looking for. Oh, one other one I think I should mention is going with renewable energy.
Yep.
So that's another great way to reduce a organization's carbon footprint. We talked about that a few TAD talks ago. But if you can actually use renewable energy to power the manufacturing plant, you're going to greatly reduce your carbon footprint. And if you have carbon neutral goals, that helps with that as well. So this all ties together. We talked about doing sustainable operations assessments, helping companies get more efficient in their manufacturing using renewable energy. All these things come around, and eventually you get a lower embodied carbon in the product. And it's something that is, like you said, that building example you gave, that's humongous. And just think about all the materials and products that go into making a building. It's unreal how giant that carbon footprint is. And we got millions of these buildings, And they're saying now that based on population growth that we're going to probably be adding like a New York City every so many months just to keep up with the population over time. So can you imagine that many buildings having to be built and all that impact? So
yeah, definitely a big deal. So what could we as consumers do to encourage companies to reduce the embodied carbon in their products?
yeah, so number one, I think, is get educated, ask questions. We talk about this all the time. Look for companies that are actually talking about it. I know there's some companies that have done some really great things. We have customers that we work with, like Assa Abloy, that has a really solid sustainable product innovation program, and they've been able to show significant embodied carbon reductions in their products, and they're advertising that. Interface is another one. They just came out with a new carpet backing called Sequest, and it actually, what it does, it takes plant-based materials and carbon that's been absorbed out of the atmosphere, and they use it in the product, so they're getting to be a carbon negative product. So there's activity out there, which is exciting. But I do think the more that you ask the companies that you buy from to do these things, and to think about it like, companies like Patagonia, Procter & Gamble, they're all thinking about these things. And I think you start to look at some of this information, you can see how that would really drive down the embodied carbon. Even like a company like Coca-Cola with their World Without Waste program, where they're looking to get the bottles back, turn them into new bottles, and then they would have so much recycled content. That is going to drive embodied carbon reductions as well. So supporting recycling is another great support thing you can do. If you really do recycling like we talked about a few weeks ago, make sure you are recycling, and just really encouraging reaching out to manufacturers, letting them know you're aware of this and you want them to do more. I think that's going to drive the change, because we all drive the market with the money we spend. So if we just keep doing that, I think it's going to really help. So.
Yeah, definitely. And embodied carbon is a very hot topic right now. So we did create a downloadable PDF with everything you need to know about embodied carbon, and we will put a link to that so you guys can understand embodied carbon and why it's important, how it connects to LEED, and some more options for companies to reduce embodied carbon. So keep on the lookout for that, and please let us know what you would like to hear about in a future TAD Talk. We are taking suggestions.